Hi, Grandma. I hope you enjoy this recording. We had a fun time making it for you. Her Many Lives and Names. A brief biography of Margaret Muriel Commodore, read by her many kids, grandkids, and great grandkids. We love you, Graham.
The many names of Margaret Commodore. Margaret Muriel Commodore, the Honourable Margaret Joe, Markie, Mugsy Joe, Margaret Joe, J.P., and Landslide Margaret all point us to different stories about the same woman. Each name highlights segments of a remarkable life split largely between two dramatically different worlds: the lush, temperate climate of the Stolo, the lower Fraser Valley, and the dry, harsh, extreme climate of the subarctic Yukon. When Prime Minister Brian Mulroney appointed Kim Campbell as his Minister of Justice in 1990, there was much excitement among the claim that she was the first woman in Canada ever to hold that portfolio. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appointed Jody Raybould Wilson as Minister of Justice in 2015, there was a huge celebration around the claim she was the first Indigenous woman in Canada to have that position. While accurate with respect to the federal parliament, neither claim was entirely true. The first woman and the first Indigenous woman to hold the position of Minister of Justice in Canada was Margaret Commodore, who served as the Minister of Justice in Canada's Yukon Territory from 1989 to 1992. And these were only two of Margaret's many firsts breaking gender and racial boundaries in Canada. Each first made quietly, humbly, confidently, without the need to shout, "Look at me!" Margaret spent her youth in Chilliwack, British Columbia, where she was born into a family of Indigenous royalty. Her working life was centered in Whitehorse, Yukon Territory, where she became New Democratic Party royalty. In her retirement, she divides her time wintering in the south and summering in the north, while she is widely respected as an elder among the Stalo community in the Fraser Valley. She draws little attention there. In the Yukon, she is a celebrity.
When she spent her 90th birthday in Whitehorse in October 2022, representatives of all three parties paid tribute to her in speeches at the Yukon legislature. Speaking for the Premier and the Liberal Party, the Honourable Jeannie McLean, Minister responsible for the Women and the Gender Equity Directorate, called Margaret a trailblazer and one of the women who led me to the Yukon Legislative Assembly. She holds a special place in the hearts of many Yukoners. Curry Dixon, leader of the official opposition, spoke about her impact on sports in the Yukon. Kate White, leader of the NDP, spoke about her truly epic life and her many firsts. All agreed that we owe a debt to Margaret in this territory, as the entire legislature rose in a standing ovation. And just the day before, 200 people attended her birthday party. Not to mention, she has her own chapter in a book about powerful Yukon women, that there are dozens of articles about her in the Yukon Press, a Wikipedia entry, a National Film Board documentary featuring her as a role model, and an appearance on CBC's long-running show Front Page Challenge. The Chilliwack Times called her easily one of Chilliwack's most successful daughters. This article tells the story of how little Markie Commodore from Swally became Muggs, a residential school survivor, one of the last witnesses to a fire that burnt the Coqualeetza hospital to the ground, the first Indigenous woman to play league softball in the Fraser Valley and the Yukon, one of the first Indigenous practical nurses in British Columbia, and then Mugsy Joe, one of the first Indigenous justice of the peace in the Yukon, the first Indigenous woman in any cabinet in any parliament in Canada, then the Honourable Margaret Commodore, Minister of Justice, a mother of three, a grandmother to seven, and a great-grandmother to five. Holy. Some of these stories overlap, and others are so distinct, it's hardly an exaggeration to think about each of her names representing one of her many different lives.
Hey Nana, it's Coady. I'm going to be reading chapter 2 of your book. I love you, and I'll see you in the funny papers. Chapter 2. Margaret's Ancestors. From her earliest days, Margaret did not need to wonder if she was an Indian. Born into a family living on the Swali Indian Reserve to two parents who were both legally classified as Indians. But nothing is as simple as it first appears, and one of the themes that weaves through Margaret's life is how the Federal Canadian Indian Act, first proclaimed in 1876 and still in effect, made and unmade Indians. One great-grandfather, her mother's grandfather, was an Englishman, born in 1846 in Kirby Knoll, a hamlet on the edge of the North Yorkshire moors in England. William Prest's family emigrated to Ontario when he was a child, and as an adult in the 1870s, he moved to Chilliwack, British Columbia. Together with his common-law wife, Mary Ben, an Indigenous woman, he had 11 children. The family farm was near Little Mountain, east of Chilliwack, and today the name Prest Road remembers them. William ultimately married Mary in 1897, less than a year before his death, and by virtue of the Indian Act, which stated that Indigenous women marrying non-Indigenous men lost their Indian status, Mary and her children were no longer Indians. Their son, Margaret's grandfather, Thomas Prest, married May Little, an Indigenous woman from the Coqualeetza First Nation at Fort Rupert on Vancouver Island, and she too lost her Indian status on marrying. Among their at least 7 children was Teresa Jean Prest, Margaret's mother. On her father's side, Margaret's great-great-grandfather was John Suelis, a well-known Stalo figure. When the gold rush swept through the Fraser Valley in 1858, he ferried miners traveling to the goldfields and used his knowledge of the river as the pilot of the first steamship to reach Yale and was thereafter called Captain John. Seeing all the social disruption that accompanied the gold rush, and particularly the effects of alcohol on his people, in the 1870s, Captain John embraced Methodist Protestantism and let much of his traditional practices lapse. He led the Swali community to build a Methodist church and cemetery on land adjacent to his house. Owing to his enterprising nature and his Protestantism, the colonial and later federal authorities recognized him as the chief of Swali. Captain John's only daughter, Sarah, married William Commodore. William's son, also named William, married Amy Lorenzetto, a Stalo woman from the Chilliwack area. Together they had a son, William Andrew, known as Andy, in 1907. Unfortunately, William died of tuberculosis when Andy was only 3. Amy then remarried William's cousin, Albert Cooper, and together they kept a dairy farm on the Swali Reserve. Albert was the hereditary chief, but Margaret says, "In my opinion, my grandmother ran the reserve. They were farmers, and they were good farmers, selling their milk to the Fraser Valley Milk Producers Association." In residential school, Amy had lost some of her fluency in the Stalo language of Halkomelem, and the couple did not pass it on to her son. Andy recalled being the first Indigenous child to attend the nearby Vedder River Public School until dropping out after grade 6 at the age of 14. He then found a series of well-paying jobs as a logger and helped his parents on the dairy farm between jobs. In 1928, he met Teresa, Prest, and they started to date. In the fall of 1930, he asked her what she wanted for her birthday present, and she said, a wedding ring. So they married on her birthday, November 14th, 1930. Teresa, with part Indigenous ancestry, became a legally registered Indian on that day by virtue of her marriage to Andy and joined him on the Swali band list. The children started their lives as Indians. Andy and Tress had 2 children, Norman, born 1931, and Margaret Muriel Commodore, born in the Chilliwack Hospital in 1932, just across the street from Margaret's condominium where she was living when she was interviewed for this biography 90 years later. By this measure, she had not gone far in life, but there are other ways to measure life's travels and accomplishments. Margaret was named after her mother's best friend, who was called Mark by her family and friends. In honor of her namesake, little Margaret was known to everyone as Markie. At that time, the family lived with their dog, Baloney, in Captain John's former house next to the church he built and the cemetery where he was buried, just down the hill from her grandmother, Amy Cooper. As a member of the Commodore and Cooper families, Markie was born into the high-status families in Swali. And that is all for Chapter 2. Again, I love you so much, Nana. And now I'll leave it to the next person to continue reading.
Chapter 3. Markie's Happy Place. The Deep Bay Years. Footnote reads, this section draws on interviews with Margaret, her collection of life stories, Keith Carlson's unpublished biography of Andy Commodore, and the book by Rita Levitz and Leah Willett, Images and Voices of Lighthouse Country. By the time Markie was born, the Great Depression had taken its toll on Sawali, and like many men, Andy had to leave home to find paid work, in his case in the United States. With Andy gone and money scarce, in 1933 Teresa was invited to join her widowed mother May Little Prest and two of her mother's brothers who were working at a fish cannery in Deep Bay on Vancouver Island. Taking Norman and Markie, the pregnant with Bill, Teresa moved to Deep Bay. Soon after, Andy joined her and found work in the cannery pitting fish. Thus, Margaret's first move from Sawali was to Deep Bay, a village owned by the Deep Bay Fishing and Canning Company, and, after 1935, by BC Packers. The hamlet of 100 or so houses surrounded the cannery where salmon was processed in the summer and fall, and clams were processed in winter. It was a compact, cosmopolitan village, with a string of wooden buildings stretched out along a gorgeous sandpit overlooking Denham and Hornby Islands, and what Margaret called Yellow Rock, now known as the Chrome Island Lighthouse. Margaret remembers these years as the best of her young life. I call Deep Bay my happy place. The village was a paradise for kids, a multi-ethnic melting pot where the children saw no ethnic boundaries. In addition to the Commodores and Prests, there were indigenous families from Fort Rupert, a significant Japanese community, and workers from China, Germany, Italy, and elsewhere. We had a small house by the beach, sort of right in the middle. I think the school was on the other side of the cannery. I remember a lot about my first year there. We lived in a little house. Few had electricity at the bay, except the plant, and we had an outhouse. The well was just down a little ways from the house, and they had a big clothesline that went way down to the beach to a high pole. I remember a big battery-operated radio that the family gathered around to listen to the news and a radio play called The Shadow Knows. Her father Andy also found work organizing the logs dumped into the bay by logging companies. Jumping from log to log, Andy would herd and chain the logs into rectangular booms, and tugboats would tow them to the distant sawmills. At age 6, Markie started to attend the Deep Bay Public School alongside First Nation kids from the Fort Rupert Hunt family, Japanese and white children. She says she does not recall any racism. All the kids played with each other. In summer, they particularly enjoyed swimming out to the log booms and diving off them. Many of the fishermen were Japanese, and their wives worked in the cannery. They had beautiful flowers in front of all their houses, and I remember they had a bathhouse there. I also remember my teacher, Miss Brody. I don't remember really a whole lot about learning anything, but I remember standing there and looking out the window all the time. It was an intensely rich family time. My family lived with Grandma May Prest, and Grandma Amy Cooper visited us. My mother and her sister sort of traveled together, and she had 3 single brothers at that time. I had cousins, so there was a whole bunch of us around, and they all played musical instruments. So there's a lot of singing and playing and all sorts of really happy stuff. 2 boys playing with matches in the net loft started a fire that burnt the cannery to the ground in 1937, and when it was rebuilt, BC Packers also built a plant to render oil from dogfish. The oil was used as a vitamin supplement, an additive to paint, and the carcasses turned into fertilizer. The reduction plant provided jobs, but was the source of the worst odors. Margaret remembers that the locals called it the stink plant, and the neighboring communities from Bowser to Denham Island found the smell so offensive that some people moved away, while others tried to close the plant down. People from Deep Bay, when shopping out of town, were immediately identified by the lingering stench on their clothes. Even after she started at residential school, she continued to spend her summers with the family in Deep Bay, which provided her with an anchor and an annual rejuvenation. I'd have two grandmothers there at the same time, and they both knit sweaters. I remember my grandmother over there when I came home in the summertime from residential school and helping her wash her wool. She was getting raw wool from somewhere, and all of her grandchildren would be sitting down there with her, and then she'd throw all of her wool out on the branches to dry. And then she'd bring it in, and we'd have to sit there and tease it to get rid of all this stuff that was in there. And then card it, and then she would spin it. Child labor for sure, she said with a laugh. But she had enough grandchildren, so it was a really happy time, and I called it my happy place. But in the summer of 1942, she came home to a dramatic change in the community. All the Japanese kids and their parents were gone. In April of that year, the entire Japanese community had been forced to leave their homes and possessions as the men, women, and children were sent to internment camps or to work as farm labor in Alberta. They were driven up to Bowser and then put on the train or bus for Vancouver, Markie's former teacher, Miss Brodie, remembered. One of the real elderly men was sure he was going to be shot. Many families gave their plants and flowers and household items to their non-Japanese friends, while the fishermen had their boats confiscated. These Japanese people had beautiful boats, anywhere from 25 to 40 feet long. They were in immaculate condition, and some of them were new. If you had $500, you could buy one, recalled one resident. Rather than let them go to others, two of Markie's uncles, Bert and Earl Prest, bought Japanese boats. In 1944, Andy and Teresa moved 12 kilometers up the coast to Fanny Bay and rented a little, really small place next to the logging railway tracks. Andy worked making log booms with the G&F Logging Company, a highly skilled and dangerous job, spending his days dancing from one floating log to another. And Markie started to spend her summers there, playing on the log booms with the other kids. By this time, the family had grown to include Bill, Faye, Earl, Sharon, and Betsy. Later, Andy and Teresa adopted the twins, Barry and Gary. Markie remembers hearing war news on the radio and from the newsreels, which played at the start of the rare cinema shows she got to see. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the death of Mussolini, and the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Most vividly, Markie remembers a lot of shouting and cheering from the tavern, and then a railway speeder zipped past her house, blowing its horn, and people started shooting guns in the air. It was August 14th, 1945. Japan had just surrendered. World War II was over. Over the next winter, a flood washed out the G&F camp at Fanny Bay. Andy was offered a position at the G&F camp near Hope, and Teresa moved again, this time briefly to Laidlaw, near Hope, and then to Hope, only 50 kilometers from their home community, Sawali. In 1950, she moved to a camp so close to Sawali that they moved into Amy Cooper's old house on their home reserve. End of the chapter.
Chapter 4. Markie becomes Mugs, the residential school years. At the end of summer 1939, I'm not sure why, but my brother Norm and I were shipped from Deep Bay over here to Coqualeetza residential school. I remember the little dorm that we stayed in with all the little girls, but the main thing I remember is running water and indoor toilets. I had never seen a toilet until then. I don't remember anything really bad, and it was bad enough that I wasn't at home. Coqualeetza was a United Church-run school in Sardis, BC, just a few miles from her grandmother Amy Cooper's at Sawali, and Amy visited her grandkids at the school. Margaret did not remember much about that year, but if there was anything wrong, she, Amy, would have done something about it. She was a strong woman, respected by everybody. The next summer, Markie was back in Deep Bay, but the following year, Coqualeetza was transforming into a tuberculosis hospital, so she and her siblings were sent instead to Alberni Indian Residential School, 70 kilometers across Vancouver Island, on the west bank of Somas River, about 4 kilometers north of Port Alberni. Even though it was closer to her parents, they were seldom able to visit. Markie spent 8 years in residential schools, 7 at Alberni. She has some pleasant memories about the time at school, particularly the friendship she formed. She also has many regrets and painful memories about how she and other students were treated at the school. And then there is one memory. so painful that she buried it away for half her adult life. Residential school is the first place I ever went that I was called Margaret. And one day, I think it was grade 6, when one of the teachers, Mr. Tide, asked me a question, and I answered it. Then he said something like, "Thank you, Muggs," and everybody started chuckling, but I didn't know about what he was talking about. And I finally said, "Well, that's not my name." He told me it was a nickname for Margaret, and from that day, everybody at the school started calling me Muggs. The overwhelming feeling from her stories of residential school life is one of confinement and isolation from siblings, from family. We couldn't go anywhere unless we had a supervisor with us all the time. We got up in the morning and we got ready. We had to do some chores first, and then we'd go and eat, and we went to school for half a day, maybe 2 or 3 hours, and the other half we all did our jobs, even kids as small as 6 or 7 years old. The first year she was at Alberni, the classroom building burnt to the ground. She suspects it was deliberately set by some local indigenous people. The school was burnt down once before. Before the fire, they were able to be outside at least during the toing and froing between classes. But after that, the students were all crammed into the main building. We grew up with 200 other students and were raised by strangers who knew nothing about us. They called us savages and told us our culture and traditions were wrong and that we were stupid to believe in them. For 8 years, I was told we were inferior because we were not white. And so we were housebound, like almost 24 hours a day. We ate in the dining room. We slept in our dorms. We went to the school in the rooms that they had to make into classrooms. We couldn't go anywhere without supervision. And we did mix in the classroom and in the church, but on separate sides of the room. It was the only place we mixed. And well, the boys were on one side and the girls were on the other side. So that was the real confining part of my life. And it still bothers me to this day, because for 24 hours a day, we never got outside. And it was regimental, is the term that I would use, because we'd have to line up to go and eat. We'd have to line up to go to school. We'd have to line up to go outside. And the bell was always ringing. And I forgot about that bell. They all dictated our every move in that school. We were confined to our side of the building and the girls' playground, and the boys on the other side. And I had 5 of my siblings there, but we weren't even allowed to spend any time with our male siblings, except maybe once a month they let us visit in the assembly room. The kids weren't even allowed to go home at Christmas time. I remember on Christmas Day we had cornflakes, and that was a treat. We had cornflakes and an orange. You do what you have to do, you know. You can't spend 7 years there being angry all the time. You get into a routine and make friends, and we did a lot of stuff together. We did have a lot of laughter. I hung around with a couple of my Squamish girls from North Vancouver who were my really good friends. My best friend was Doreen Harris from Kispiox, and we remained friends until she died. I was a little bit of a rebel too. I used to get in trouble a lot. I didn't do bad things. I ran out of bounds and stuff like that. We'd sneak around the corner and maybe talk to some of the boys on the other side and stuff like that. And maybe once in a while, I'd catch my siblings. But I did run away a couple of times with Doreen. There was one building that was close to the school, and they kept the vegetables in there. And we snuck in there one day and stole some carrots, and we got caught. I'm not sure why we stole carrots, but we got strapped a lot. Strapping was normal. We got strapped and we got confined to our dorms, and they locked the door. They always lock the door at night with the key still inside, but we had to stay there 24 hours a day. So on the weekend, we tied some sheets together, and she was holding one side, and I was going down first. But anyhow, the sheet broke. I went flying, and thank God I landed on top of a whole bunch of flowers and some dirt instead of the sidewalk. Everybody was at the movie. They used to have a movie on Saturday night, so I went upstairs, I opened the door for Doreen, and we took off, and we ran all the way down to Port Alberni, and we were on some road. I don't know how far away. We got caught and brought back, and we were strapped. The next day we were having church or something, and the key was still in the door, and we were locked in, so we had to put something under the door that pushed the key out and pulled the key in, and then we took off, and then we heard all this noise, and so we went running down to the playroom, and we couldn't get out again, and we got caught again, so we got strapped again. And then they put us in the infirmary and nailed the windows shut, and we were confined in there for, I don't know, a long time. There were some staff that I knew didn't really like strapping, and others that just loved it. The principal, Mr. Caldwell, he loved to strap people. He gave us a strap one time. They were building a new schoolroom the last year we were there, and there were some boys in there, and we saw them in there. About two or three of us. We went in there, and we were just having fun talking to the boys and laughing, and we got caught, and Mr. Caldwell strapped us. You got strapped if you got caught out of bed at night after you're supposed to go to bed. There was that abuse that just went on and on and on. That strapping was a horrible thing. A lot of people don't know why residential school survivors can take a lot of pain. By the time we left, a lot of us could get strapped all day, and you wouldn't form a tear, and that was bad. That takes a lot out of you when you never think about it. But when you start remembering things, and you remember standing there with your hands out, saying to yourself, "You're not going to make me cry. You're not going to make me cry." And they couldn't in the end. Beyond the straps, Margaret did not see the other abuse, with one important exception. There are people that tell stories from Alberni, some stories about seeing different things and, out of bounds, and I used to be out of bounds all the time because I used to have to go somewhere, and I don't remember seeing anything like that. And all the 7 years that I was there, but that's not saying there wasn't stuff that happened. And I remember a lot of straps, but I don't remember anybody getting punched out. A lot of people talked about food, and I don't remember the food. I don't remember starving. They had a garden there, and we ate a lot of garden stuff. I worked in the kitchen, and they cooked a lot of potatoes and stuff. And we used to have dessert with almost all of our meals. However, she does have one memory about the food. I've not been able to eat rolled oats since I left. I just can't think, and it makes me sick because every morning we ate porridge. It was horrible to look at for 200 people in one big pot. Muggs discovered one great thing about herself while at Alberni that changed her life. She loved to play softball, and she was good at it. Very good. I don't remember having a regular ball field, but we had two, and we had bats and balls, and I don't remember having gloves or anything. I was always really tall for my age. The kids that came through that school, we were really small, and because I was the biggest one on the team, they made me the pitcher. So that's what I did all my years of softball. It was something that I really enjoyed. Reflecting in her 90s back on her time in residential school, Margaret especially remembers the regimentation, the sense of confinement, the frequent straps, and how it affected her ability to be the mother she wanted to be. When you become a parent, and my ex-husband was a residential school survivor, we based a lot of our teachings on what we learned in residential school. When we were trying to discipline our kids, but the way we were raised in residential school was not good. But there is one memory that pushed way down deep, so deep that it did not emerge until she was in her 50s and is discussed later. Thank you, Grandma. Love you lots.
Chapter 5 Muggs the Adventurer. When Muggs was 12, her family had relocated to Laidlaw, BC, so she spent 2 of her summers there, and that's where I first learned how to smoke. I think I was 13. By the next summer, her parents had moved again into the nearby town of Hope. That was the end of her residential school time. When she was 14, a new arrangement between the federal and provincial governments allowed Indian children to attend public schools. So in 1947, Muggs enrolled in grade 9 at the public school in Hope. I didn't stay. I couldn't handle it. After being housebound in a big building where you go to school and you sleep and you work and you read and stuff like that. Residential school curriculum had left her behind the other kids in public school. It was really hard for me to be in a class, like a normal class, because what I had for 8 years was not normal. Even though many of her cousins, her mother's sister's children, who were not status Indians, were going to the school, it was just too strange. She turned 15 in October, and during the Christmas break, she found a job at the former Coqualeetza residential school where she had spent a year. By then, it was a tuberculosis hospital for Indians, and Muggs was working as kitchen help, washing dishes and bringing food to the patients.
The experience of working and living in the hospital staff dormitory was preferable to going to school, so she told her mother she was going to quit school and go to work. I hadn't finished grade 9. Her mother tried to keep her in school, but I argued with her. My mother was a really nice, soft-spoken woman. She never hardly ever raised her voice. I told her I was going to quit school because I'd already had a taste of working for a living for 2 weeks and I liked that better than school. She finally said, "Well, if you can get a job, I won't argue with you anymore." So I got a job right away at the hospital and I went to work there. I was 15 and I've been out on my own ever since. Mugs lived in the hospital dormitory, almost back to the same space she occupied when she was a student there at age 6. They had a lot of women, all different ages, in the 2 dorms above the operating room, and we shared a bathroom in the middle. We had to take all the food up to the different wards and serve the patients their food on a tray. There was a great big wagon where you put slotted trays and they filled them up and then take them around to everybody in the hospital because they couldn't leave their beds. Then we'd have to go and pick that up, bring all the dirty dishes down, and wash them. We worked a split shift. You had a couple of hours off during the day, then we had to go back for supper. It was really hard, but I was there on and off from 1947 to 1965. And I remember good people. There was one white woman there that I washed dishes with at my first job, and she used to take a bunch of us young people to her home and give us perms. She was a good person, and I liked working with her. She was always wanting to be nice. I guess she was just born nice or whatever, raised right, but I can't remember any nasty people working there. There was a lot of local Stola people that were working at the hospital, some working there for years. She says that her experience and what she saw does not corroborate. So much negative stuff out there. There was negative stuff. I'm not shying away from any of that, but she neither witnessed nor heard of any abuse of the patients in the years she was there. With her best friend Helen, later Helen Bonner, who also worked at the hospital, she played ball with other women around the hospital. They used to create activities for us to do. We both knew we were good players, and so we joined a softball team in Chilliwack. Her and I were the first 2 Aboriginal women to play organized ball. I think she played third base or shortstop, and I pitched. That was unheard of in those days. Racism was endemic in Chilliwack. Jobs were harder to get, rental accommodation was denied us, and we had to sit in the back left-hand seats in the theater. I've never let circumstances stop me if I wanted to do something, but I certainly have experienced a lot of racist attitudes and met a lot of bigots. It bothered me when I was young, but I never considered it a barrier. Because not too many people can pitch, They play all kinds of other positions in softball, but I was the pitcher. I liked it, and I was good at it. And I kept at it, so I was always needed, and I chose to practice and be better. And it gave me a lot of confidence. It's what helped me gain confidence in my life because I was needed for that position. Plus, I enjoyed playing ball. I really did, and I played organized ball up until I was 55 years old. I was a darn good ball player. The summer she was 16, Mugs and her older cousin Edie Press decided to head out on their own to make some money and see Washington State. Many British Columbian Indigenous people headed south in the summer to make money picking fruit and hops. Mugs and Edie stayed overnight in Seattle with a relative and then first went to Yakima to pick hops, then to Omak to pick apples. She recalls that the workers in Omak lived in 3 rows of wall tents, canvas structures with wooden frames, one for Indians, one for whites, and one for blacks and Filipinos. They had the choice of cooking for themselves, or a bus would come by to take them to a dining hall where they could buy food. When the apples were done, she was joined by a young woman from North Vancouver, and they hitchhiked at night in a car with 2 black men to Moses Lake to dig potatoes. When asked, "Did you like picking hops and fruit?" she answered, "Well, I really didn't like any of it, but I was out in the world. We never made any money, just enough to live on." There were fun times, though. We had fun there because there was a lot of things that were happening. After picking apples, there was lots of people playing ball and sitting around campfires and stuff like that. We didn't mix much with the whites, but we did with the blacks. I used to play catch with this black guy, and he thought I was pretty good for a kid. I was 16, and we'd sit around at night and tell stories. I've always felt that I raised myself, because my parents didn't raise me, the school did. I was independent from a young age, I really was, and I think that's why I was so overly protective with my kids, because of what I did and the risks that I took. Both on her trip to the States at age 16 and in her later teens in the Fraser Valley, she had a couple of scary hitchhiking encounters, one involving threats with knives and the need to run away and take refuge in the nearest house, and in another case, having to jump out of a window to escape a threatening situation. I wonder how I got through those crazy times that I did and how lucky I was that I got home. I have been pretty lucky in my time. Living back at home in the fall, Mugs got a job in the laundry at the Coqualeetza TB hospital. Everybody had to wear a uniform back then, and they were all starched. We used to press all the uniforms and hang them up, and then we had to go fold all the sheets and pillowcases and stuff like that, going through the mangle machine, the irons, and fold sheets. It was the two people grabbing the sheets, folding them up, and putting them down. And people would stand there and just watch us in amazement at how we did that. For some reason, I really liked that. I used to ride my bike from my parents' house in Sarawali and back all year long. I had a flashlight so I could see the road after dark. I remember working in the laundry at that time. I was taking some of my parents' laundry, sheets and pillowcases and stuff like that, in 2 shopping bags. God, I must have been in good shape because I was going up the hill. It is about 7 kilometers each way from Coqualeetza to her parents' house, with a steep hill at the end. Her fitness carried over to canoe pulling. Henry Mussel's family recruited her, her mother, and her sister Betsy onto the crew for their war canoe, the Golden Arrow, and they became the first women racers from Chilliwack on a team drawn from Squay and Sarawali. She had to quit smoking to keep up with the nightly practices, and it paid dividends when the crew won first prize at Lummi Race. At Coqualeetza, the hospital administrator decided that a lot of us had the potential to be better educated and had a bunch of us start in correspondence courses. I kept on doing that for the longest time, and I always read. I have been a reader my whole life. He encouraged Mugs and some of her coworkers. With his wife, he invited us to dinner at their home in Cultus Lake, and we had a fancy little meal. I think he was trying to show us a different way of life. I hung around with a couple of Squamish girls from North Vancouver who were really good, a crazy part of my life. I would hitchhike with them to North Vancouver on weekends. Between working, playing softball, going to the odd movie, and socializing, Mug spent her late teens between her home in Sarawali, her work in Sardis, and her friends in North Vancouver, all the while keeping in touch by mail with her friends from residential school.
Chapter 6, The Coqualeetza Fire. While still working at Coqualeetza and after commuting from Sarawali for a time, Mugs moved back into the dormitory at the Coqualeetza hospital, making it easier to get to work and sharing the space with 10 or 15 other women. On the night of Friday, November 19th, 1948, we were finished work and laying around or sitting around in our dorm upstairs, and then we heard what sounded like a great big wind happening. We looked out the window, but there was no wind out there. That there was no wind prevented this from being a worse disaster. We could hear it get louder. I went and opened the closet door and the smoke came right out of the door. I slammed it shut again. And we all got excited because we knew there was a fire somewhere, right? A fire had started in the ceiling of the operating room. Somebody dashed to the other side and told the rest of the girls there was a fire. We weren't quite sure what to do. So we're all standing around and we noticed one of those things that said, "In case of fire, break this glass." Guess who broke the glass? I did. Setting off the alarm system, I remember the matron, Alice Bush, coming up to our dorm with this really thick emergency book in her hand. She told us we have to get out of there, out of our rooms, and take what we could. And then we've got to start getting the patients out, so the rest of the night was filled with doing that. This one woman from the dorm that I was in said, "Well, I'm not leaving my clothes." And I said, "You can't go in there." I think I was 15 or maybe 16 by then. She said, "Well, I'm going to get my clothes," and she went in there and she grabbed her clothes holding her mouth. She grabbed what she could in one hand. Everyone else, including Margaret, lost all their clothes and belongings. Of all the stuff that I lost, the one that I missed the most was my pictures of Alberni. I had a lot of pictures of my friends and I missed those more than anything. We were following the directions from the people with regard to what to do with all of the patients. They sent us mainly into where the little kids were, and we were carrying them out and being directed to where to take them. This seemed to go on all night long. It was just crazy. Patients were carried to nearby Carmen United Church and the Sardis Community Hall and into nearby homes. A whole bunch of houses had taken these people in, and whenever I think about that, Margaret said, I think you know how much kindness there is out there in the world, when you can take somebody into your home that you know has a very infectious disease. The community jumped in to help. The bus to Cultus Lake pulled over and the passengers and driver helped get people out. Local women were making beds in the 2 community halls before the evacuation was complete and made tea, coffee, cocoa, and sandwiches for the patients, staff, and firefighters. Volunteers from 4 fire departments worked 12 hours to put out the blaze, which destroyed the north and east wings, about 60% of the hospital. One of the most difficult fires they had ever experienced. Nearly 1 million gallons of water were pumped out of the nearby Luckacuk Creek, slowed somewhat by thousands of leeches that kept plugging up the intake. The staff evacuated 150 patients without any casualties, including about 35 who had to be carried. I can't even remember where I stayed that night. I had no clothes. Later, we did get clothes from the Red Cross, but not very much. Over the following weeks, many patients were sent to the Indian hospitals in Nanaimo and at Miller Bay near Prince Rupert. Margaret was sent to Nanaimo to assist the staff there with the extra patient load. She stayed in Nanaimo, living in a cramped dorm for the first half of 1949, before they had restored enough of the burnt hospital to restart its operation. Back at Coqualeetza again, she lived at her parents' place in Sawali because there was little staff accommodations after the fire.
Chapter 7. Under the Midnight Sun. Muggs becomes Mugsy. When I turned 21, we had a big party at my mother's place, and all my friends came. It was kind of wild that I was at drinking age. I've never had a birthday before in my whole life. People came from North Vancouver and everywhere. I remember a whole bunch of people I know laughing and singing and stuff like that. We drank. We didn't drink like people do today. I quit my job, and the day I turned 21, I decided to visit my friend Doreen Harris from residential school in Hazelton. It had been 5 years since residential school, but we were only 21, but she already was married and had 2 kids. I took a ferry from Vancouver up to Prince Rupert and then a train from Prince Rupert to Hazelton. Besides her, I knew that her and her siblings and 2 or 3 other people there went to residential school. I was looking for a job at the hospital, and they didn't have any, but somebody said that the Marton head nurse was looking for a housekeeper. It was the only job available, and I took it. The problem was I did not know how to cook. I had to feed kids at lunchtime and make supper, and I had to babysit. Tried to cook, but it was kind of sad because I worked hard, but I just didn't know how to cook. I followed the recipes. Sometimes they'd be okay. Muggs loved Hazelton, so when she received an invitation in March to her cousin Dilly's wedding in Whitehorse, she thought she would be back in Hazelton before too long. With her savings, she caught the CNR train to Prince George, and then from there took a plane to Whitehorse, arriving with $2 left in her pocket. Whitehorse in the 1950s was a small military town with about 5,000 people. Most houses had no running water, and outhouses and honey buckets were common. Water was delivered, honey buckets emptied, and supplies came by paddle wheel or up in the Yukon River. Her cousin was marrying a soldier. Another cousin was a soldier stationed there, but aside from them, she did not know a soul. The wedding was exciting, and I met so many strangers who became friends. But after the wedding, she urgently needed a job. The military was the biggest employer in town, and the Army Obedience Corps needed a clerk. In spite of not being able to type, she was hired, and luckily the work was mostly mail room and mail delivery, and actually typing limited to addressing envelopes, which she accomplished with 3 fingers. At first, she lived with her cousin, who was rooming with a family up in the Coady subdivision. Then she moved with her newly married couple, and then to the old downtown Army barracks used to house civilian women employees. All of sudden, all of the all of a sudden I was the only Indigenous person wherever I went. Complete integration, and was so strange, but a whole lot of fun. Later, when they built the barracks for single women up the hill in Camp Coady, she moved again and lived with 90 other women, and we pretty well hung out together. We got along. We did all kinds of things. It was a new experience for me. I was 21 years old. There were people from all over Canada there. In the barracks, there was indoor plumbing, a rec room with table tennis, and a mess hall where they fed. Buses provided transportation and to and from work. Every day was a new day of meeting people and doing whatever was happening at the moment. I hardly ever met another First Nations woman while I was there. All the people that I hung out with were white, just so different. And it was so free. I only once remember experiencing racism up there. She was introduced to 10-pin bowling and Skagway. One of her newfound friends had a dog named Mugsy, which they thought was just hilarious. And gradually Muggs became Mugsy, and that's how I got that name. Whitehorse had a women's softball league with 4 teams, and Mugsy quickly became known for her pitching skills. Everybody knew me because it was a small town and everybody went to the ball game. As much as Muggs loved Hazelton, Muggs loved Whitehorse even more. I just loved it. I absolutely fell in love with the place that helped me grow, helped me to be somebody. Those were the fun days. And part of the fun was being really involved in softball. These days stretched into weeks and then months and finally into 2 years. Margaret recalls 1954 to 1956 were the best 2 years of my young life. We had lots of parties, and Whitehorse Inn was one of the oldest hotels there was, and it had the Whitehorse Ballroom. The ballroom dancing really fancy, and we used to get all dressed up in fancy clothes and go out to dances there. Even if I didn't have a date, I'd go. Fun was what we did. We just had fun. Not surprising, Mugsy had a boyfriend, and we were talking about getting married and stuff like that. She also missed her family, so she flew home for a family visit in the summer of 1956 with the idea of returning north in the fall. It was 9 years before she returned, and needless to say, that little relationship just didn't go anywhere.
Chapter 8. Markie, Mother, and Nurse. I had just come back from the Yukon and was staying at my parents' house at Suwali when a guy came by the house. He was a coach for a softball team from Hope. They didn't have any softball teams in Chilliwack. I don't know why. But he came up to my parents' house and wanted to know if I would play ball for them. Back in the Fraser River, he saw Markie again. Of course, I said yes, but I said I need a job. So he got me a job in a service station in Hope as a gas jockey. They hired a few women way back then because you didn't have to pay them as much as the same wage as a man. This was the second time she had experienced pay discrimination in the Yukon male clerks. Doing the same job as her made more money. Stupid, she exclaims. So I played ball in Hope all that year, staying with some past relatives. I never forgot the Yukon. It was always special in my life, and I always wanted to go back. In the meantime, she met a guy, John Mason, known to everyone as Jack. He could play the guitar and he had a really nice singing voice. In 1957, the two got married. But because Jack was not an Indian, this had its own life-changing implications. Markie received a little blue card that stated she was no longer an Indian. To be an Indian in Canada in the 1950s and 60s came with a lot of handicaps. Indians could not vote in federal elections until 1960. Indians could not drink or buy alcohol. So the most common adult social activity for all Canadians was illegal for Indians. And many paid fines or went to jail just because they had a few drinks. Indians could not normally send their children to public schools or public hospitals. So the government created separate Indian Day and Indian residential schools and special hospitals like Coqualeetza. On the day one hand, her marriage freed Markie from all these handicaps. And now at least she could vote. And for the first time have a say in who ran the country. And so who decided Indian policy? But there was a huge downside. Markie lost the ability to return and live in her home, community Sawali, because non-Indians were not allowed to live on a reserve. As a non-Indian, she lost the opportunities which are just starting to grow. To get financial support for education from her band, she was also lost the tax-free status on the reserve Indians enjoyed, and because of the sexism in the Indian Act, her brothers, even if they married non-Indians, and her sisters who did not marry non-Indians, kept the benefits. It quickly became apparent that her marriage had been a bad choice. But it took Markie almost 3 years to get out of an increasingly bad situation. The couple moved to Quesnel, BC, where Jack made a habit of writing bum checks, which he did not have the funds to pay, and as a result, was in and out of jail. When out of jail, he was increasingly abusive, and at one point, Markie fled back to Sawali. He came to retrieve her from her parents' place and drove her down nearby the Chilliwack Lake Road, where he pulled her out of the car and started beating her badly. I must have been screaming and making lots of noise because the next thing I know, there's a guy standing with a gun telling Jack to stop beating me. Jack took her back to her grandmother, to Amy Cooper's place, where she put Markie to bed and looked after her. But she also let Jack stay there. Markie went back to Quesnel with him, then fled again and went to work in the chambermaid work in Lytton, not letting him know where she was. But in those days, even caring parents wanted bad marriages to work. So her mother told Jack to find her. They had a daughter, Jackie, and when Markie became pregnant with her second daughter, Tracy, also known as Trace, she left him forever. I was determined not to go back, and I always wanted. I always say the only good thing that came out of that is my 2 daughters. She only saw him once after that, when he was imprisoned in Ocala prison, in nearby Burnaby, and she took his daughters to visit him. For years afterwards, I just kept hearing stories about him. He had a girlfriend in Saskatchewan, beat her up, and she died. He was charged with manslaughter. It could have been me. She divorced Jack, but did not get her status back. I have a brother who married a white woman. She's a really neat woman, and I really like her. The ironic thing about that is that when they were divorced, she had the option of keeping her Indian status and her house on the reserve for herself and her 5 children. Once I was divorced, I didn't have the option of getting back my status back. That's an example how screwed up the Indian Act was. The victims of it were Aboriginal women like myself and my children. A single mom with 2 babies and no option to return to Sawali. It was hard. I had no access to washing machines, so I was washing all the clothes with a scrub board and then hanging them outside to dry. And we were living in dumps. You should have seen some of the places I lived in. I can't believe it. I had to go on a welfare for a period of time. I was doing odd jobs like all the time, ironing, washing clothes for a doctor that lived close, sometimes doing housework in somebody's house, picking corn, wherever I could make extra money. All three of them wore second-hand clothes for 7 years, and she worked and raised 2 girls on her own. And then I finally went back to work at Coqualeetza in the laundry. Back at Coqualeetza, there was one woman that worked in administration who seemed to take an interest in me. I think she saw some potential. She called me to her office one day and asked me if I ever considered going to school, to further my education. And I said, I've been thinking about it a lot because I want to do something useful. I want to do a trade. And she said, well, I have thought about it. I thought about what you wanted to do. Well, I said, I thought about hairdressing. I couldn't even do my own hair, let alone anyone else. She said, well, I don't think it'd be very good. And she asked me if I was interested in nursing, practical nursing. And I said, no, I'm not interested at all. But she knew me better than I knew myself. I named the things that I didn't like about nursing, picking up bedpans on great big trolleys and dumping all the bedpans out and stuff like that. Plus, I said I can't stand it when people barf. I can't remember how she did it, but she convinced me that I should try it. Markie had only grade 8 education, but she had taken some correspondence courses and had worked many years in a hospital, so the nursing program accepted her and paid her a small training allowance, though not enough to support a family. One of the hardest things was I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with my kids, and they were my whole life. Those 2 little girls, they were just nothing more important to me than them. At first, she tried fostering them to a Mennonite home and family in Yarrow, where she saw them every week, but she could not stand so with social worker help at a home was found in Vancouver, where she could visit any time, but that was still too much separation. She tried living with them in one room with a hot plate. Then she put an ad in the Vancouver Province newspaper looking for a better situation. And I got a call from this one woman who said that she would look after all 3 of us. She seemed to always want to help special people, and she chose me. She just took it upon herself to help me move. We three all slept in the same room. She looked after my kids during the day and fed us. And my Jackie started kindergarten, and she used to walk her to kindergarten just around the block from where we lived every day. And she washed all our clothes, ironed our pajamas, and stuff like that. So for the last few months, I couldn't have asked for anything better. We were really, really lucky. The nursing student that spent 4 months in classes and then 8 months doing on-the-job training while rotating through different wards. When I finally got out of my classrooms and I started going to different hospitals, it was all shift work. I took communicable diseases at George Pearson. It used to be a TB hospital. I worked at pediatrics at Vancouver General Hospital, Shaughnessy for geriatrics, and Lions Gate Hospital for maternity. I played ball when I was taking my practical nursing course. There were 2 ball players from Chilliwack that were living in Vancouver, and they found out I was there. So they got me to join a baseball women's league, and at the end of the season, they named an all-star team from all of the players and made the all-star team as a pitcher. Softball helped me to get through my life by giving me confidence in something that I can do. Somehow, she found time to take judo lessons. I walked a lot those years because most of the money I went to the person that I was looking after us. With little money I had, we'd go on a bus all over town. Or I take the girls up to Queen Elizabeth Garden because we could walk there from where we were staying. We did things that didn't cost any money. And every once in a while, we'd come up here to visit my mother. The whole year was hard work, but I made it. I have a picture of my graduation. I think there might have been about 46 of us that graduated. There might be maybe 4 of us that were Indigenous, so practical nurses were mostly white. The year was 1963. I graduated at the end of the year in January, and I immediately went back to the hospital as a practical nurse, and that was really weird because my first job I had at Coqualeetza, washing dishes, and I worked my way up. As a practical nurse, with a nursing cap and white uniforms and white nylons and white shoes, she wore the uniform she had cleaned and pressed as a laundry worker. I think I was a good nurse. We lived in little places around Sardis so I could walk to work. And I always had a babysitter that was close by that could take the kids to, like a mother living at home with her kids and whatnot. I had to pay for babysitting, I had to pay for rent, I had to pay for food. I had to pay everything. And every once in a while, I'd save $2 or so, so I could go and have a couple of beers with friends. Oh, and I bowled. They had a team from Coqualeetza, and so I'd have to save enough money to bowl. The matron, head nurse, was on the team, and she made sure that I was on her team. I was a good bowler too. I used to get prizes every year for high single, high triple, and stuff like that. Instead of trophies in those days, they gave us money, which I needed very badly. And I played ball as well, so I was pretty busy. I just lived a single life and did my job, and looked after my kids and looked after my home, and never really got involved with any more guys. That was my life. And I was a single person for about 7 years more. Over her time at the hospital, new treatments appeared like tuberculosis, including antibiotics, which made the disease curable. When I first started working there, when I was young, I do remember some really sick people. The treatment at that time was lots of fresh air and sunshine, which didn't make sense. So people were dying way back then, but the time I left, the disease was becoming under control. Because of what they decided scientifically, what the better treatment was, I got different in the years that I was there, from having patients staying right flat and in bed until they realized that you have to get exercise. And it was almost like the end of the bedpans and urinals and stuff like that. That was an exciting time for me. By the time Markie, with other staff member, would take 4 or 5 or 6 kids all together and walk around Coqualeetza. Coqualeetza started to host Indigenous patients who needed care for ailments and other than TB. And they would stay at the hospital waiting for some kind of appointments or surgical procedures in other hospitals instead of staying at their home, wherever it might be. It was easier for them to be cared for at Coqualeetza and then go back and forth to hospitals in Vancouver, and very often when I was practical nurse, we would accompany them to wherever they were going. There has been a lot of bad press and negative commentary about the Coqualeetza Hospital and the other Indian hospitals, particularly Nanaimo, including stories of torture, sterilizations, murder, and unnecessary operations. And it makes me really angry when I hear stuff about that I don't think is real. Margie spent many years working at Coqualeetza from age of 15 to 33, and her experiences were almost entirely positive. She worked in every part of the hospital. Sometimes she lived at the hospital and was part of the nursing staff. Many of the other staff were Stolo, friends, and family. There were a lot of local people and a lot of parents working full-time and bringing home checks. If you wanted a job, and there was a job available, you got it. Sandra Bonner's grandfather, John Hall, worked there for years. Markie's mother worked there, and her father, Andy, worked as a groundskeeper there after retiring from logging. So did the respected elders, Siam Mitch's, French Malloy, and many other Stolo. I remember that the hard work. I remember a lot of sick people because it was TB, and I remember having to keep those people comfortable. I don't remember any physical abuse at all. When people talk about the way they were treated as patients. There was a lot of discomfort because some people, their bodies had body casts. There were people there for some kind of procedure where they had to remove some of your ribs that might have been infected somehow with TB. The one thing that I do remember that sort of things sort of bothers me is that some of the kids had to be strapped into their cribs. And the reason for that is they wouldn't stay in their cribs. I also saw some of the other hospitals when I was training, so Coqualeetza wasn't the only place. And maybe they were, hyperactive kids. There were maybe 3 or 4 sometimes. The other kids just slept. But these kids wouldn't stay in their beds, and I remember that I thought it was necessary, but I didn't like it. She was only at the Nanaimo hospital for a short period. I mainly worked in the wards with the patients, and I hear lots of stories about Nanaimo, and they talk about, people that buried and people who were sterilized and stuff like that. And I don't know how true that is. It's something that somebody else told them. I keep wishing that people who are talking about these things have something solid behind what they're trying to say, right? Because I'm open to hearing their stories and how they got the stories, and most of it is, secondhand. This happened to my mother, this happened to my father. I have no evidence that ever happened at Coqualeetza. I don't know if it happened at Nanaimo. I really don't know. And somehow or other, when I hear talk, when I hear about Coqualeetza, and I want to know the stories and where they got them from, because, I do remember very sick people, but I do remember them all being cared for in a regular way, right? In every place that I worked. In the laundry, in the kitchen, and as a nurse. Nobody ever treated us bad. We did our jobs, we got paid, and we worked. And I don't remember anybody doing or saying anything nasty to us. Coqualeetza was just like any other hospital. What she witnessed all those years was an effective hospital and doing the same as any other hospital caring for its patients.
Hi, Mom. It's your favorite middle daughter here. Just wanted to say how proud I am of being the daughter of the subject of this biography. You make us all so, so proud, and we love you very much. I hope you enjoy this reading with all your kids and grandkids and great-grandkids. Okay, love you, Mom. Chapter 9, Mugsy Joe, Activist. All the years that I was away from the Yukon, I always wanted to come back. In the summer of 1965, Markie saw an advertisement for a supervisor's position in one of the hostels for Indigenous students who went to Whitehorse to attend school, and threw an application. I really didn't have any real hope that I was going to get it because it just sounded too good to be true. I did get it, and I had to give a really quick notice because I had to be there when the school opened. Because the hostel, like Coqualeetza, was run by the federal government. She got a transfer and her airfare paid for. Back in the Yukon, she was known to everybody as Mugsy. At Coqualeetza, she'd been paid the regular government wage of $200 a month, and from that had to pay rent, food, and babysitting. In the new job, she was paid $375 a month, and she and her two girls shared a room for free at the hospital and were fed there. Oh, I didn't have to pay babysitters because they were both in school. Trace started in grade 1, less than 5-minute walk from where I lived. It was just crazy because we were so poor for 7 years. I just didn't have money to do anything extra. All of a sudden, I could buy new clothes and start saving money and whatnot. But it was a job I had a really hard time with. She found her boss overbearing and inconsistent, found the split shifts difficult, and was not always happy with how the students were treated. Although work was not going well, Mugsy was playing softball again, and her long period of being single came to an end. Out with friends at a bar, she met Bobby Joe and started dating. At the end of her first year back in the Yukon, Mugsy Commodore became Mugsy Joe, and the two married. Bobby, a heavy equipment operator, adopted Jackie and Trace, and before long, they added a third daughter, Sheila Ann, to the family. Bobby was a member of the Champagne-Ajiac First Nation. Mugsy thought, great, I'll get my status back, until she found out that Bobby had earlier relinquished his status to escape from the racist restrictions of the Indian Act. 7 months after Sheila's birth, Mugsy went back to work, but this time as a practical nurse at the Whitehorse General Hospital in the medical ward. I did shift work, and my husband also worked shifts in the mine because it was a 24-hour-a-day mine, and we struggled through all of those times with babysitters. For a few years, there was some help from her parents. In 1968, her father, Andy, joined her in Whitehorse. Andy remembered everything seemed different there. Indigenous people were hired into jobs that in BC only whites would have been hired for. Andy recalled, there was no discrimination up there. Everyone was treated fairly. Andy got what he called his first white man's job, driving a fuel truck. In 1970, Tress joined him, but in 1971, Andy and Tress returned to Sawali. After a while, Mugsy became the only practical nurse to work in the operating room, which was staffed by registered nurses. The real job was sterilizing instruments, picking up patients and bringing them up for surgery, and, preparing the whole thing. And that was my main job, putting different surgical instrument in different packs for different kinds of operations. But they also trained you to work in the ER as a scrub nurse. And once we were sufficiently trained, we were on call with a registered nurse for emergency operations. Then I worked in the operating room every Tuesday as a scrub nurse, but I was on call with a registered nurse every second week, so I worked 8 hours a day, but also when it got busy, you'd get called in any old time. And sometimes they'd have so many things happening that we would just stay at the hospital in one of the empty beds, so we didn't have to go home and come back again. I did that for about 3 years, and I really enjoyed it. I really did enjoy it. I was learning something that now you have to take special training to do. You learned about all the instruments and when to give them to the surgeon and the different kinds of sutures that they use. And when they put their hand out to you, you knew what to give them. That's how good you got. We did a lot of appendectomies, a lot of gallbladder operations, and a lot of emergency operations for car accidents and stuff like that. So that was pretty exciting. I think by the time I left, I could have done an appendectomy by myself, as I'd seen so many. Because she was on call, she either had to be near a phone or let the hospital know where to send the cab to get her. I played on a team, and the catcher worked in the ER. Every time a cab came to the ballpark, it was for one of us. If it was a broken leg that they were just going to reset or something like that, they didn't need a scrub nurse. One time we both got called in and the team lost a catcher and a pitcher. That's pretty hard to replace. One New Year's Eve, she was cooking turkey and fixings for the extended Joe family and got called in for emergency cesarean section. Whoever had to finish cooking, the party was over by the time I got home. But what happened is I was spending so much time away from my kids. Sheila was just little. She wasn't even in school yet, and my ex-husband was working at the mine, and he was also working shifts. I decided I was going to quit and take the summer off. I lasted a whole summer, and it was really nice. And when I got bored at the end of the summer, I always liked to be making my own money too. I never liked depending on anybody else to look after me. Mugsy had been volunteering at the Skookumjim Friendship Center in Whitehorse, and they offered her a job as a driver for a little Volkswagen bus that drove Indigenous children from Quanlandun Indigenous Village, then in the heart of Whitehorse, to a kindergarten and back again. God, that was such a fun job. It really was. The kids were just cool, and I could take Sheila with me since she was still too young to go to kindergarten. I did that for 1 or 2 years. At one point in the early 1970s, the military decided to sell off houses that they'd built for their members. It was first come, first served choice situation that was to begin on a Monday morning. When they drove by on Friday night, Mugsy and Bobby saw people already lined up, so they quickly changed plans and joined the queue. They stayed in line in the queue all weekend, 16th in line. When they got to the front, their first and second choices were taken. They got their third choice. And I'm glad we did, because it was a nice little spot. We had it for almost 30 years. On the board of directors of the Friendship Center, Mugsy threw herself into fundraising and community organization for floats for the annual Sourdough Rendezvous Parade and community dances. We started hearing a lot about non-status Indians. They were starting to organize right across the country. With the help of the government, they had money available. They encouraged by visits of Henry Butch Smitheram, who is in 1969 founded the BC Association of Non-Status Indians and played a major part in funding the Native Council of Canada in 1970. Butch convinced us that we should try and start our own organization in the Yukon, so we scheduled it for the next time he came up. There were quite a few of us. He told us what we had to do to start our own organization. George Asp was elected as president. By that time, I knew most of the First Nations people because I played ball. Somebody nominated me as the vice president, and I'm sitting there shaking my head, but nobody else wanted to do it, so I let my name stand, and I was nominated and elected, just like that. In 1972, they had formed the Yukon Association of Non-Status Indians, Yancey, and Mugsy had a paying job as the vice president. The first thing we did as a non-status organization was give a group of people identity. Non-status Indians have been called the forgotten people. We weren't accepted by Indian Affairs and weren't white, so we were ignored by other institutions that should have been responsible for our needs. Mugsy was vice president of Yancey from 1971 to 1974, and again from 1975 to 1978. At Yancey, we started looking at the kind of problems that everyone was facing and finding out why a lot of us had lost their status and the living conditions that they were living in and what was lacking in their lives because they lost their status or never had status. There was no housing for them. There was no money for furthering their education. It was just a whole bunch of that kind of thing. We found out different kinds of money that could be available to try to improve things. Yancey established branches in each of the Yukon communities. We put our whole souls into it. We worked hard. The housing conditions up there were really bad way back then. There were people who were living in really unsafe conditions, really cold in the wintertime. We started applying for different kinds of funding, and the one program that I remember was called Winter Warmth from CMHC to make the houses a little bit warmer. And we did that in a lot of different houses around the territory. Some of the conditions were just horrible. Not only was she invited as a special guest to a ceremony by the Native Council of Canada, and given an award, did she realize that she was the first woman elected to the executive of a non-status organization in Canada. 2 years later, while still at Yancey, Mugsy met with 9 other women at the Skookumjim Friendship Centre to form a group focused on the needs of Indigenous women. They organized a meeting of women from all the Yukon Indian communities, and in June 1974, and the Yukon Indian Women's Association was formed. One of the issues they focused on was the disrespect shown to Indigenous burial sites. Yukon first built grave houses above the graves of their deceased relatives and placed the belongings of the deceased into houses. Tourists were interested in this exotic culture, and busloads sometimes disrupted funerals and often left garbage at the cemeteries. In 1975, the Women's Association organized demonstrations and forced the government to take down the signs encouraging tourists to visit the cemeteries. However, as late as 1978, the cemeteries were still being promoted on tourist literature. So in October that year, they held another demonstration and put up signs at the bottom of the 2 Mile Hill in Whitehorse, telling tourists that the cemetery was a private place, and the association also worked towards creating a transition home for fleeing women from domestic abuse, which opened in March 1980. Another focus of the Women's Association was to reverse the gender discrimination embedded in the Indian Act, which deprived women of their status and rights if they married a non-Indian. They added their voices to the campaign, which in 1986 finally culminated in Bill C-31, which restored and protected status rights for women and their children. Ultimately, Margaret and her family benefited from the decade of work on the part of thousands of Indigenous women to change the laws. At the same time Yancey was forming, the federal government was opening discussions with Yukon Native Brotherhood, which represented status Indians, to reach a comprehensive Yukon and land claim settlement. Europeans had occupied the territory without permission of First Nations, without treaties, and so had no legal right to be in the Yukon. At that time, the federal government was only interested in negotiating with status Indians, and there were many status Indians not interested in sharing any future settlement with non-status people, and yet many of the elders wanted their non-status grandchildren to have their legitimate land rights. Progressive thinkers in the Brotherhood and Yancey overcame these tensions and joined together in 1973 in an umbrella council for Yukon Indians to negotiate a land settlement. This was the first united approach of the status and non-status Indians to the land title question in Canada, and the start of a 20-year process which led in 1988 to the Yukon Umbrella Final Agreement, which became a model for other modern treaties in Canada. I've always had an interest in the law. At Yancey, we had a group called Yukon Indians and the Law, where we worked with First Nations people who had problems, especially those who had been abused by the RCMP. If some RCMP member gave them a rough time and did something they weren't supposed to do, I would go directly to the chief superintendent. I don't know how I did that, but I did. And he kept telling me that you don't have to come to me every time you have problems. And I said, but otherwise, when would he listen to me? She relayed stories of police abuse, like suspects being driven out of town and left in the cold. All kinds of things like that happened. One of the sub-judges at the time realized my interest, so he asked me if I was interested in becoming a JP, Justice of the Peace, and I said, well, I don't know. In 1980, the Yukon Association of Non-Status Indians and the Yukon Native Brotherhood members were merging their operations, and Mugsy was available. I went through a period of training for 6 months under a program called Northern Careers Program, and I worked with Chief Judge Barry Stewart, learning about sitting on the bench and dealing with people who came to the courts charged with different summary charges and stuff like that. At the end of it, I had to take exams, and I ended up with a position in May 1980. A Whitehorse Star article at the time was headlined, Margaret Jo, Native Activist, becomes Margaret Jo, JP, still pushing for the forgotten people. Mugsy became the first Indigenous Justice of the Peace in the Yukon, and she was well suited to the role. She had been in advocacy roles at Yancey for 7 years, As JP, she issued summonses, warrants for arrests, subpoenas, heard cases of those charged with those summary offenses, arraigned accused persons, and sentenced those who pled guilty. Most of the cases that came before her involved Indigenous people, many of whom, like her, had suffered in residential schools or from domestic abuse. I knew about 80% of the people that came before me, she said. I knew firsthand what it was like to be subject of a subject of the Indian Act and to have experienced racism. I felt there were far too many natives in trouble because of alcohol, and something needed to be done about this problem of minor offenses. As JP, Mugsy officiated at 18 weddings, conducted bail hearings, and tried those with minor offenses. I was so well known by the people there that I didn't like sending people to jail, but sometimes, like after your second impaired driving, it was automatic. She was good at the job and quickly became one of the senior JPs in the territory, an executive secretary to the JP Council, recruiting and training new JPs. She also traveled to remote Yukon communities with the judge, and together they set up a diversion process for first-time offenders to accept counseling and community work and a chance to wipe their offense from their record. These were very busy years for Mugsy, the mother. I was playing in a league, my husband was playing in a league, my girls were playing in the junior girls league, and I was coaching them. She was coaching the Pipeline Blasters, an Indigenous women's team including her daughters, pitcher Jackie, catcher Trace, and Sheila at first base. I'm really proud of that little team. We were busy almost every single day. It was our summer life in the Yukon, and yet, whenever she could take a real break, she and the family would go camping and fish the Yukon's innumerable rivers and lakes. Despite being deprived of normal parenting at residential school, she believed she was a good mother to her girls, except that she never was much of a cook. When re-elected to her Yancey vice president job, Sheila remarked, "Oh no, another year of alphagetti." I was really involved in so many things, and I just fit the kids in around that. But today, she says, my kids still laugh about that because I was an overly protective mother. I didn't let them do a lot of things. I did that for the first 2 years. I really liked it. It was a job that could have gotten me maybe even into law school sometime. I had so much left to learn, but I guess I was destined to do something else.
Hey Grandma, it's Caley. I just wanted to say I'm so proud of you and I love you so much. This book was so wonderful to read and I really love learning new things about you and our family. I also really love discovering more about your very rebellious spirit, and I saw a lot of myself in those moments, which was really cool. Thank you for being an amazing grandma and such an absolutely amazing, strong, inspiring woman. I love you so much. Chapter 10, The Honourable Margaret Jo. In 1982, a palm reader told Mugsy, "You're going to do great things, you know." Bobby Smith, writing about her in the Yukon Indian News, put it another way. Mugsy has an unquenchable desire to forge ahead, challenging her abilities. While really enjoying the challenges and opportunities of being a justice, Mugsy saw yet another opportunity to both challenge herself and help others. She had been a longtime member of the New Democratic Party, and the party was seeking nominations for a candidate in the riding of Whitehorse North Centre, which included at that time the Kwanlin First Nation. Becoming an MLA was one of the bravest things I have ever done in my life. It took a lot of courage on my part to believe that I had the ability to decide that I would do this job and convince people to vote for me. Because justices had to be apolitical, she had to give up her job. I don't know what I would have done if I had lost. I gave up the security of my job without ever having any idea what the results would bring. All I knew was that I wanted to run and I didn't want to wait another 4 years. First, she had to win the nomination, not an easy task, because the Yukon NDP president, lawyer David Costco, had already been selected to run in that riding. In reporting on this, one of the most critical nominating battles for this year's Yukon election, the Whitehorse Star described her as well known as a Native community activist, a founding member of Yancey, and a softball coach. Ultimately, Costco decided to run in a nearby riding. Mugsy also had to contend with a Conservative Party advertisement which stated that Indigenous NDP candidates held obvious biases which do not represent the view of the majority of Yukoners. Mugsy told the press that smacked of racism. One Yukoner, Audrey McLaughlin, who helped run Mugsy's campaign, later became a member of Parliament herself and ultimately national leader of the NDP. I was so very nervous knocking on doors of strangers and letting them know who I was and why I wanted the job, not knowing the kind of reception I would get, and always the question in the back of my mind, was I good enough for this job? Despite scare tactics and the fact that she ran against the Conservative incumbent Municipal Affairs Minister, she heard the good news over the radio while at her daughter's softball game. "I won," she bellowed, and the team ran over to congratulate her. After rushing over to the Legion to celebrate with her NDP colleagues, her daughters, Jackie and Tracy, serenaded her. "I am so excited now, I don't know what to do, except take tomorrow off," Mugsy told the crowd through happy tears. She had been elected as a member of the official opposition led by Tony Pennicott. The Conservative Party had won the most seats. Margaret Jo, as she was called in her official capacity, was the third Indigenous person to be elected to the legislature. She became the critic for justice and women's issues, two topics she was on top of. Referring to her time with Yancey, Mugsy later said, "After 7 or 8 years with those kinds of organizations, you learn a lot about politics." Margaret Jo wanted to improve the lives of First Nations in her riding and beyond. When I was an MLA and knocking on doors in Quanlandud Village, some of what I saw in those houses was unbelievable. As ever, she was attuned to the issues of Indigenous people and women and spoke in the legislature about preventing domestic abuse. One of the problems that I have seen in my time spent in the courts is the length of time that a person has to wait before he or she finally gets to court to deal with the case. In the case of the victim, sometimes that person will have to wait for months on end. In the meantime, she has been battered over and over again. Margaret worked hard to get to know the people of her constituency, and every Christmas delivered cards to every door. Ultimately, she had met and knew every family in her riding. In 1985, she ran again and won her seat handily. As the polls closed all over the Yukon, the Conservatives and the NDP were tied, 7 seats apiece. Only one riding had not been heard from, Old Crow, and the phone lines were down. Which party would form government hung in the balance. Finally, a HAM radio operator got the message through. The NDP had won the Old Crow seat by 8 votes, and so the NDP was elected government for the first time ever in the Yukon. I walked outside and let out a scream of joy. We were successful. No one was as surprised as the newly elected NDP MLAs. The Liberal leader, Roger Coles, was subsequently convicted of a criminal offence and resigned his seat. In the resultant by-election, a new Democratic won and the NDP had their first majority. 5 of the 9 NDP caucus members were First Nations. This election marked a major turning point in Yukon history and politics. The previous governments considered their main role was to represent the white community and natural resource extractors. The previous Conservative governments had, in the words of a more recent NDP leader, Liz Hanson, governed under a climate of disrespect for Yukon First Nations, whose voices regarding natural resource development, education, and other significant issues were routinely ignored. 4 of the Conservative cabinet members had, between 1979 and 1985, resigned over various scandals. The NDP were determined to be different. The new Premier, Tony Pennicott, appointed Mugsy, or as she was known in the legislature, Margaret, as the Minister of Health and Human Resources and Minister responsible for the Women's Directorate. Mugsy became the Honourable Margaret Jo, Canada's first Indigenous woman cabinet member. In her first speech to the House, she said, "It is my intention as Minister to achieve the best possible combination of equity, security, opportunity, and sharing, coupled with economic efficiency." She noted that sharing was a basic Yukon characteristic. The miner on the creek did not lock his cabin because he believed it was a responsibility to help those who, through the hand of fate or some disability, could not provide fully for themselves. 80 years later, sharing is still an important aspect of our society. Coinciding with her re-election was the breakup of her marriage with Bobby Jo. "I stayed married for 18 or maybe 20 years. I'm just not good at being married. I think I've been too independent. I never really spent a lot of time doing stuff like, I was always a good housekeeper, but I could never cook. And I had jobs that took so much time away from my own family." By then, her 2 oldest daughters had moved out, but Margaret was still raising Sheila and a granddaughter, Capri. Most people have no understanding how hard this job is and how much time it takes. You always have to be there for the party, the caucus, your constituents, and that can be pretty hard on family life. It's the kind of job that you've got to want to do before you try to get in and do it. Changes in the Indian Act in 1985, thanks to Bill C-31, which Margaret and so many others had fought decades for, allowed Margaret to regain her Indian status and her membership in her home Sewali band. It also meant that all of my children and grandchildren, and even my ex-husband Robert, who gave up his status when he was young, got their status back. For Margaret, who had worked for years with Yancey and the Yukon Indian Women's Association to return rights to Indians who had lost their status, getting our status back was one of our greatest dreams. The federal government had made the Indian Act discriminatory between brother and sister. The entire thing was a discriminatory process. They planned that within several decades there would be no Indian people, that we would all be assimilated. Thanks to Margaret and her many sister activists, that goal was never reached. When the Yukon NDP became government in 1985, Canada was in a deep recession and the Yukon had been hit hard by mine closures, bankruptcies, and outmigration. So the new government decided to consult Yukoners on what the priorities should be. Her government initiated a participatory citizen consultation through a process called Yukon 2000. Joyce Hayden described Yukon 2000 as a way to bring together hundreds of Yukoners of diverse backgrounds and interests in roundtable discussions. It was an attempt to make a fresh start for the Yukon and resolve, or at least moderate, the fiscal, racial, sexist, political, and environmental discord that existed within the territory. They hoped to brainstorm a plan for sustainable economic development into the new millennium. Margaret began to implement the home care program that had been planned by the previous government. Many older Yukoners were choosing to retire in the Yukon, and both governments believed that home care would enhance the ability of elderly, disabled, and chronically ill Yukon residents to maintain a more independent lifestyle. It was also less expensive than institutional care. She also directed her staff to begin the repatriation of disabled Yukoners at the Woodlands Institution of British Columbia. When she became minister, Margaret took charge of the small women's bureau that had been sidelined with 2 part-time staff in the minister's justice portfolio. We set it up as its own department called the Women's Directorate with 3 full-time staff and created an advisory council on the status of women. Family violence was a serious problem, so she appointed a task force led by Yukon psychologist Paula Pascali to hold consultations on family violence in Yukon communities, and outcomes included a safe house for women and family counseling services in Watson Lake. Her department increased support for transition home services in Whitehorse and funded the opening of second-stage housing for victims of family violence. Her department also supported the establishment of family mediation services through the Yukon Public Legal and Educational Association and territory-wide family anti-violence programming. She also created an advisory committee on substance abuse and an advisory committee on Indian child welfare, chaired by Mary Kane. Margaret herself toured the territory with her Assistant Deputy Minister Bonnie Clark, discussing the issues of the Yukon's young people, visiting 13 different communities. Yukoners told her that young offenders should be dealt with in their own communities, and so she worked to make that a reality. When they had some time between villages, Margaret would stop by a bridge and pull out her fishing gear that was always in the trunk. Another of the first things that we did was put together a plan for childcare. We opened up daycares. I don't think then they had a single real daycare. At Yukon College, we created an early childhood education program. The former government, in 1 year, had maybe a couple $100,000 in their budget for that. By the time I left, it was over $4 million. The Chilliwack Press described her as having created what is arguably Canada's best childcare system. It was the most popular social policy initiative that we ever had, Tony Pennicott later said. With her fellow NDP MLA from Old Crow, Norma Cassie, she argued that Yukon College must have family residences, a child care center, and an early learning center, so the many young mothers from communities could study while raising their children. Looking back in 2010, Pennicott remarked, "Seeing the many young women who graduated with teaching degrees and social work degrees shows how right they were. A new group home treatment services replaced the practice of sending children south to provincial institutions. New policy and procedure manuals were drafted for adoption and fostering children in care and other areas of child welfare. New adoption disclosure and access to information regulations and procedures were introduced." In May 1986, on behalf of her government, Margaret signed an agreement with the Champagne and Ajax First Nations to start an innovative pilot program giving the band primary responsibility for child welfare. Designed for the specific needs of Yukoners, it recognized the family as the primary resource in resolving child welfare issues and included measures to strengthen family resilience. Such agreements have since become the standard Canada-wide. In March 1986, Margaret celebrated the voluntary movement of the Kwanlundun First Nation in her riding from their village surrounded by industry to the new urban subdivision of McIntyre. One of the proudest moments of her first term in cabinet was her government's approval of the land claim agreement in principle, which, when signed in 1989, was the culmination of work that started in 1973 when she joined Yancey. Regarding this, Premier Tony Pennicott later said, "We 8 MLAs rejected the previous Tory government's view that Yukon Territorial Government's role at the land claims table was to represent the white settler population. Instead, we argued that a treaty with First Nations was in the public interest, so we aimed to represent all Yukoners in land claims negotiations. More important, we supported Aboriginal self-government and helped negotiate the first such agreements in Canada." Joyce Hayden, who served as an NDP member of the legislature with Margaret, wrote that during her term as Minister of Health and Human Resources, Commodore changed and increased greatly the scope and intensity of government intervention and involvement in health and social services to Yukon people. Margaret was just getting started.
Chapter 11, Minister of Justice. Hi Gigi, this is Casey. Gigi was easily re-elected in the February 20th, 1989 Yukon election and joined leader Tony Pennicott as the NDP returned to government with 9 seats. She continued to be responsible for the Women's Directorate. While she was appointed Minister of Justice, the first indigenous women to hold that responsibility in Canada. As her term project, she took charge of the Public Service Commission and works compensation. I can't read that.
Skip over it.
Board. In many ways, her life had prepared her perfectly to be the senior legal official in the territory. Her experience, both confined by the Indian Act and then denied the affordance of it. A survivor of sexual domestic and cultural abuse, and activist, a liaison with police and a justice of the peace made her extraordinary well qualified qualified, and she took on the role with enthusiasm in February 1990. She hosted the first federal female Minister of Justice, Kim Campbell, and 11 other provinces and territorial ministers of justice at an Aboriginal Justice Conference in Whitehorse, where she told them, "You cannot tell Aboriginal people what it is they need in Aboriginal justice or tribal justice or native policing or whatever. What you have to do is listen to those people who have been through the system." This book was kind of hard to read, so I'm going to give it to my parents now. I love you because you're funny and nice and yeah. See you in the funny papers, Gigi. Gigi, I love you so much.
Hello, Gigi. This is Michael. I'm gonna keep reading here. Page 63. Sometimes I would stay by the fire all night. It was late in the summer and quite dark, so I couldn't read. Occasionally, people would come and sit with me. That summer brought out a lot of anger and a lot of hurt that I had been hiding deep within me for so very long. I started to feel really angry about all the things that had happened to me. I still feel angry when I talk about it. I was just not dealing with it. I had been so angry at people for such a long time. I was doing what other people had been doing for years, blaming everybody else for what happened to Aboriginal people. Disturbing memories of abuse in residential school started to arise, an issue that she did not feel able to fully address until she retires from politics. But the Oka summer started her on the path. That summer was probably the most healing thing that could have ever happened to me. She was there when they lit the fire, and she was there when they put it out. She told her colleagues in the legislature, "During the Oka crisis this summer, many people were faced with the hopelessness that this is so prevalent in Aboriginal communities. It is a frightening situation when people get so fed up with negotiating, so tired of talking, and so disillusioned with the courts that they resort to violence. I can never support violence, and I feel there must be some peaceful resolution to the frustrations of Aboriginal people all over this country." Her work in the Yukon certainly contributed to the peaceful, improving relations between her government and First Nations. Being in cabinet also meant more travel. She attended annual meetings in different parts of Canada with the federal, provincial, and territorial ministers of justice and the ministers responsible for women. She also presented at conferences in Norway and Africa. Among her other accomplishments in her term, she expanded the Family Violence Prevention Unit and offered support systems for victims and counseling for perpetrators. Because alcohol abuse was such a large problem, she reversed a historic eye-popping law that allowed Yukoners to consume alcohol and drive at the same time, and made the Yukon the first jurisdiction in Canada to put fetal alcohol warnings on liquor bottles sold in government liquor stores. One of the initiatives of the NDP government was the establishment of a Yukon Human Rights Act, which led to bitter debates in the legislature and angry constituents pounding on Margaret's door. The act extended protection to gays and lesbians, making the Yukon the first jurisdiction in Canada to do so. I believed it was some of the most progressive, leading-edge legislation in the country at that time, a later observer remarked. It offered some solid hope to desperate citizens suffering from various sorts of prejudice and abuse, including the demons of sexual, racial, and accommodation discrimination. One of her final projects was the Yukon's first Employment Standards Act, which got held over to the next administration. When the House was not sitting and she could take some time off, she would fish the local rivers, or on longer breaks return to the mossy banks of the Chilliwack River and Sweltzer Creek at Suwali to enjoy time with her large Stolo family and do some salmon fishing. The significance of Margaret's appointment as Minister of Justice was not lost on the rest of Canada. The Chilliwack Times called her easily one of Chilliwack's most successful daughters. The National Film Board featured her as one of 5 Indigenous role models in Carol Getty's 1986 documentary, Doctor, Lawyer, Indian Chief, and the national TV show Front Page Challenge, which ran for 38 years on the CBC. Featured her as a mystery guest who had been in recent headlines. I love you, Gigi. I hope you're doing okay.
Hi, Gigi. This is Noah. I'm in grade 1. That book is a little too big for me to read a chapter this morning. I wish I could. See you in the flying papers. I love you, Gigi.
Hi, Graham. It's Capri. One of the panelists on the TV show journalist Alan Fotheringham had gone to school in Chilliwack with Margaret's older brother Norm, while Alan's father had been the business manager at the Coqualeetza hospital when Margaret was working in the laundry there, so they had several points of connection. Margaret is most proud of what she accomplished as the Yukon's Justice Minister. I've always had a strong interest in Aboriginal justice, and I think that what we were able to do to help First Nations communities was really important. The cultural healing process is what's been missing from our institutions for all of these years, and if there's one thing I'm really pleased about is the development of the Aboriginal justice in the Yukon. The model she established in the territory has since spread across Canada. In assessing the 2 Pennicott terms, Jim Butler, longtime Yukon resident and Whitehorse Star editor, wrote that the Pennicott government, amid turbulent, often nasty resistance from some of the Yukoners, the 2 regimes forged a lasting definition of fundamental generational transformation in the territory's fascinating political, economic, and social evolution. They absolutely redefined for the good the territory's erratic relationship with its Indigenous peoples. Pennicott's 2 governments had launched an enormous, well-intentioned experiment molding a more modernized, arguably a downright civilized territory from the rough-around-the-edges version they'd inherited. The change was too much for some of the Yukoners, and in the election of October 1992, the Conservatives won, and while the NDP was returned to the official opposition, Margaret first had to fight for the NDP nomination in her riding, which she won handily, but then only won her legislature seat by 2 votes, prompting the press to teasingly call her Landslide Joe. The criticism that the government was not doing enough for First Nations, that they were hard to reach and arrogant, and did not seem to ring true, and it stung. In opposition, she fought to see the Employment Standards Act, which she had created, become law. At one point, in frustration, filibustered, standing in the House to make a long speech. When it was over, I had a really hard time breathing because I never stopped talking for 3 hours. She served the legislature in opposition until the election in 1996, when she decided not to run again. By now, with many years divorced and her status and membership in the Suwali band name regained, Margaret decided to reclaim her birth name and officially changed it back to Margaret Commodore. In 1995, she was honored by the Yukon Democratic Party with the Kiyoshi Harris Award for outstanding work for the party. When she announced that she was not seeking re-election, the White Horse Star editorial headlined its "Farewell to a Dignified Humanitarian." Editor Jim Butler wrote, "Her career is constructed of spectacular variations. She clinked glasses with justice ministers from across Canada. She zealously pursued the more mundane tasks, demanding the removal of the blockade across the South Access Road to the shipyards area of her riding. Commodore's loyalists treasured her most for her humanity." This former justice of the peace could probably count on one hand the number of people who profoundly disliked her so fondly she disregarded upon her patience, benevolence, and unhesitatingly willingness to help her constituents in others in need. Tempered by the scandalous cancers of Indian residential schools, inspired and strengthened by the orations of the late Tommy Douglas, encouraged by those who believed in her contribution to society's betterment, this admirable figure still contemplates helping others. Losing generous, dedicated citizens such as her makes the territory a lamentably diminished society for those that she leaves behind. When she retired from the legislature, she had served her constituents for 5,229 days, still the second longest term for any Indigenous person in the Yukon legislature. She says, "Every day was a learning experience." I love you, Graham. I hope you're starting to feel a little bit better, and hopefully we'll see you in the next couple months or so. Take care. Love you so much.
Chapter 9, Margaret Remembers the Residential School Abuse. It started out as an ordinary day, her term as a cabinet member, with an invitation to view paintings from a well-known artist at the nearby library, but the experience was anything but ordinary. It cracked open a wall Margaret had built around her memories of abuse at the Alberni Indian Residential School. For a long time, it didn't appear to affect me, and one day I was in a gallery looking at some of Jim Logan's paintings, and every one reminded me of residential school. My reaction was totally unexpected. All of a sudden, I felt something I'd never felt before. I went back to the office, I turned my chair to the wall, and I started to cry. The tears flowed for a very long time. That's when I realized what had happened to me was not normal, that I had been in denial. The pain had been there for so long, I did not even realize that it was there. A few years later, Margaret saw artist Rob Hamilton's name on the news talking about the abuse at Alberni Residential School and called him up. That started a journey towards healing. Ron invited her to an honorary ceremony for 18 men who had been abused in Alberni. I knew I had a problem. Now, I didn't know how big of a problem it was until I got to the meeting in Alberni. When it was over, I ended up talking to a counselor, and I spent about 2 hours with him, and that's when I started to feel the nausea that was to plague me for the next few years. It was a nausea like you had to throw up every single time, and I had a pretty rough time after that. You scream, you throw up, you hit things so hard because you're trying to get rid of everything. I went into a sweat lodge, and I screamed in agony, trying to get rid of that horrible man. A lot of us were abused sexually, she remembers with tears. A group of us got together one night and reported the individual that did this. We never heard another thing about it. We thought things would get better. They didn't. He stayed, and the abuse got worse. When interviewed in 2008, after Prime Minister Harper apologized to Indigenous peoples on behalf of Canada for the residential school nightmare, Margaret said, "It was decades ago, but the pain never leaves." The nausea persisted after she was retired from politics, and when she moved back to Chilliwack, she knew she needed to get more help. In 2000, she registered for a 6-week-long program at Soughton Laleham in the Noose on Vancouver Island, moving beyond the traumas of our past. In addition to counseling, the program used psychodrama, which involved clients reimagining themselves as a child facing the abuser and acting out the abuse stories of other clients. It was a wrenching experience to have someone else portray little Mugs in those situations. Boy, did I suffer going through all of that stuff. It was terrifying, and when it was over, her and I were both screaming. In spite of having to face the abuse directly, Margaret said, "It's the best thing I ever did. It really is." You can't go there just once and expect the pain to leave you. It's something you have to do more than once, and you have to deal with so many things you didn't know were even there. She ultimately went 4 times, each time dealing with another of the situations she experienced, before she felt she could continue to heal on her own. The final time, she served as an elder, supporting other clients on their healing paths. Later, at age 80, Margaret was invited to tell her story of abuse as the first witness when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission held hearings in Vancouver. You can imagine how difficult it was to tell a story in front of an audience of 7,000 people, but Margaret felt it was important to add her voice. "I won't apologize for my tears. I deserve them," she told the hearing. "The hardest thing I ever had to do was think about the dysfunction that I imposed on my children. It made me really, really angry that no one had ever taught me how to be a parent. I came from a really loving home. I had 2 good parents. Somebody thought they were much wiser than the rest of us, and they took us away to try to make us a different person, but it didn't work. I feel sadness and pain. Reconciliation is a big word. What does it really mean? Does it mean we have to forgive? Does it mean we'll have to get over it? We never really get over it. I have forgiven most of the people in my life. To this day, I have not been able to forgive my abuser. I can't do it. I was such a little girl when I went there, and he took so much away from me." She still considers herself on her healing journey. Her final words in front of the TRC were, "I'm very grateful for the life that I have, for the people who are sitting here with me today, who helped me through my journey. For my children who came from the Yukon to be here today, I love them." 2 men, Donald Haddock and Arthur Plint, were tried, convicted, and sent to jail for sexually abusing children at the Alberni residential school. Mugs's abuser never went to trial.
Chapter 13, Margaret Commodore, Stalo Elder. In 1996, when Margaret began musing to people in the Yukon that she was thinking about moving back to Swally, it made headlines. "Commodore considers leaving the Yukon," read the Yukon News, and the Whiter Star lamented the end of a political era. Margaret never did leave the Yukon. She just started to split her life between her adopted home where she had a daughter and grandchildren and her ancestral home where she had 2 daughters and grandchildren. Rather than having to choose the Yukon River over the Fraser or salmon over grayling, she chose both. She did, however, choose rainy winters over icy ones. Since 1996, Margaret had been a dual citizen, spending 8 or 9 months a year in the Chilliwack area and 3 or 4 in the Yukon. "I love the summers up here, but I can't handle the winters anymore. I used to go and spend time with my parents in Swally. Then I would come back and I would miss the family. But within a few days, I was glad to be home here in the Yukon. All of a sudden that changed and I didn't want to leave there," she told her friend Joyce Hayden. "I intend to move back home to the Stalo Nation, and one of the reasons I can do that now is because I've got my status back. I can go back home and live on the reserve. I can go home and run for chief if I want to. I can go back and live on my own land. Even though it's a reserve, it's where all our culture is. I can go home and build a house and get involved in things that are happening down there. I've got this whole big extended family out there and tons of things yet to do." Retirement from politics gave her the time to work on her personal healing from the scars of residential school and a chance to apply her many skills closer to home. It also, for the first time in her life, allowing her access to Stalo traditional culture, and that was increasingly calling out to her. After 30 years in the Yukon and a life at the pinnacle of Yukon politics, it was strange and relaxing to be back in the Fraser Valley, where she was hardly known outside of her extended family. "When I came back home, nobody knew me anymore, because when I did come home, I would visit my parents, and I came home once or twice a year, and I didn't go out and meet a whole lot of new people." In 1997, she was recruited as the project coordinator for the Stalo Nation Healing Center feasibility study, which looked at putting a healing center in the men's prison. After that, she did contract work on community justice issues for the BC government and Queequelstum, the Child Welfare Agency. She also supported the local NDP and candidates. In 2013, as mentioned above, she was back in the media as the first witness at the Vancouver public hearing of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In 2022, she was an invited guest of the 40th anniversary meeting of the Federal and provincial and territorial ministers responsible for the status of woman to acknowledge her pioneering role. She takes great pleasure in following and supporting her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. My grandmothers were organizers. I used to get really mad at them because they were so bossy, but when I think about how I bossed my grandchildren, now I have to laugh. On the large deck outside her apartment, gladiolas are among her favorite of her extensive container gardens, which she refurbishes each spring. She enjoys the greenery, but laughs as she says most of the flower action takes place while she's summers in the Yukon. She was a casual fan of the Canucks hockey team until 2011, when the two Sedin brothers joined the team and it went to the Stanley Cup final. Thereafter, she became a devoted fan and remains so today, often traveling to BC Place to catch the home games. Her condo is brightened by the vivid blue and green of the Canucks logo, splashed across pillows, blankets, and other memorabilia. So, you can imagine the pleasure she experienced when she was at the Canucks game in December 2023. She was singled out at intermission. The cameras broadcast her face to the crowd as she was introduced as the first Indigenous Minister of Justice in Canada and was wished a happy 91st birthday. Ever since her great-grandfather, Captain John, embraced Methodism, the Commodore family had not been deeply engaged in Stalo spirituality. This started to change with her father, who in his retirement found great comfort and satisfaction in delving more into cultural practices. There is a cultural pull that has called me back to my roots. Since then, she takes great pleasure in attending the spiritual events in the Longhouse, where her daughter Sheila is a winter dancer. Reflecting back on her life and her reasons for having her story told, she said, "The kinds of things that I've done, I believe, are quite exceptional. Leaving the place where I was born and then traveling around and doing a whole lot of things that I didn't even imagine would be a part of my life. I've more than exceeded my expectations in life. I could never sit back and not do something to change things, and with the positions I've held, I've been able to make those changes. I feel really good about that. I really do want people to know this story because it encourages other people to go out and see the world. There's more to life than Suwali, the Stalo Nation, and the Fraser Valley, because a lot of people don't go beyond that. They really don't." Margaret broke her routine for her 90th birthday and went to Whitehorse in November, where her daughters had arranged a party. Nearly 200 people filled the hall, including family from BC, old friends from her days at Yancey, softball teammates, colleagues from her days in government, in-laws from the Joe family, and several sitting MLAs. Dinners, speeches, and slideshow in her honor lasted until 11 p.m. I was smiling and laughing and crying all night long. The outpouring of respect and love was followed up next day by tributes from all parties in the legislature, which affirmed how she had touched so many Yukoners in her 30 years of full-time residency. All the leaders knew her personally. Curry Dixon, the leader of the opposition, explained how her incredible political legacy and the contribution to the political growth of this territory deserves much commendation. He spoke about her exceptional legacy through her contribution to sports in the Yukon, and how Mugsy mentored his mother as a ball player and as a recreation director at Yancey. Honourable Jeannie McLean, Minister of Education, spoke of knowing Mugsy her whole life starting, no matter what your political affiliation or whether you are Indigenous or non-Indigenous. We owe a debt to Margaret's leadership in this territory. The word trailblazer is a fitting description. She encouraged legions of people to participate in public life and mentored them. She will also be known as the woman who led me and many others to the Legislative Assembly. Margaret holds a special place in the hearts of many Yukoners. NDP leader Kate White and Margaret taught so many of us to be brave, to be loud, and speak our truth. She holds up and continues to advocate for those values of human rights, social justice, fairness, and equality for all. She lives and breathes and shows that these attributes are possible. She is a true Renaissance woman. She has lived a truly epic life. We love her. The house rose again and again with standing ovations among the attendees at the birthday party the previous day were 4 little great-grandsons running around wearing matching t-shirts that read, "My Gigi is 90 years old and is still cool." A new name for this phase of life, Cool Gigi. Still a dual citizen of Stalo territories and the Yukon at 92, still with a glimmer in her eyes and a smile on her face. Margaret is now 92 and cool as ever.